The route to school was about 5 to 6 blocks. So on that date, Maurice left alone and she disappeared.
This was indeed one of the more unimaginable things that happened to this community back then.
What's happening to my family's life? Why have we been inflicted with such a horrible injury? People crying, people jumping up and down, trying to deal with the horror. Could it be someone that my parents knew, someone that Maurice knew? Could the perpetrator have been someone within our own family?
It was a question the community was asking for over half a century. Hazleton is roughly 2 hours away from New York City and Philadelphia. It's in northeastern Pennsylvania. Our roots stem from the coal mining industry. Folks here have always been blue-collar, hard-working, tough people. But that said, Hazleton has some of the biggest hearts. I always wanted to be a storyteller. And as I got older, I found out that I could tell other people's stories through the newspaper while shining the light on truth. It was quite often that folks in the newsroom would talk about the Maurice Chiavarella case. The big question was always, who did it? It was a question the community was asking for over half a century.
It's a cold, late winter's morning when 9-year-old Maurice Chiavarella grabs her gloves and leaves for school.
On the morning of March 18th, it was a normal morning. We all got up, got ready for school. The feast day of St. Joseph was March 19th. So on March 18th, Maurice was bringing canned goods in celebration of the sisters' feast day.
I was the firstborn, Ronald Chiavarella, followed by Carmen Marie. Middle brother was Barry. The fourth individual born was Maurice, and the youngest, David. Maurice, who typically walked to school with Carmen Marie and Barry, on that particular day, she left a few minutes early because she needed to get those canned goods into her classroom, hurry up and get over to Catholic Mass by 8 o'clock or she would be late. The route to school was about 5 to 6 blocks.
Maurice, however, would never make it to St. Joseph's Academy.
We'd come home for lunchtime. Barry and I came home and Maurice didn't. At first we thought maybe she just stayed at school because there was something at school she wanted for lunch that the cafeteria was having.
My father said, she didn't have any plans to do that. Go back to school and find her. So that's what they did.
Carmen notified her teacher, who in turn notified the priest, who was the head of the Catholic school.
They speak to the instructor that would be her homeroom teacher. That instructor says, I haven't seen Maurice either, and I have her marked absent through the morning classes. That's when they realized something went terribly wrong.
At that time, the priest made his way to the Chiavarella house, and they informed the family, at which time they started calling the police departments and notifying them that Maurice had not shown up for school that day.
My father realized that something went awry with the situation.
And that's when my father started looking. One of the neighborhood women yelled over to my dad and asked who and what he was looking for. And she said, if you're looking for the little girl, they found her.
About 3 miles away from the Chiavarellas' home, a man makes a grim discovery.
Arthur Robinson and his nephew were driving in what would normally be called the stripping area, which is a coal mine area out in Hazel Township.
And While he is there, he notices something approximately 25 feet down a slope from the top of the garbage dump area.
He sees what he thinks is a doll. And as he got closer, he realized that it was a little girl.
He immediately left the refuse pit and called the state police.
This blindsided people. This was not expected.
When the troopers found the dead girl, they did make some phone calls. Back in 1964, churches were big in the Hazleton area, especially the Catholic Church. The priests who were attached to the school that Maurice went to, they made their way out to the scene to administer last rites, which was common back in the day.
And one of those priests actually knows the victim and positively identifies her as Maurice Ann Chivarella.
News of the gruesome discovery reaches the family.
I remember the priests coming to the home. Family members were coming to the house.
My father's family had a lot of connections, a lot of brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts and so forth. There was nowhere to sit. People jumping up and down because their adrenaline was pumping, trying to deal with the horror that they were digesting, people crying. So I went downstairs with my dad and tried to emotionally cope with what had happened to Maurice and what was happening to my family. My father owned a grocery store. My mother, she was a seamstress, sewing machine operator. I was the firstborn, followed by Carmen Marie, Barry, Maurice, and David.
Maurice was a quiet, loving little girl.
When Maurice was in first grade, she had a speech impediment that became more noticeable. My mother got the services of a speech therapist, helped work with Maurice over several months, and she turned into an entirely different young little girl. She would clown around a lot. Her teasing and kidding was great.
Maurice and all of us would go to daily mass at church. Maurice loved the music of the organ. Would always ask our parents about getting one. So that Christmas of '62, my parents surprised Maurice with the organ. She was ecstatic.
She wanted to be like Sister Josephine. She wanted to be a Catholic nun.
She was down an embankment, and her hands were bound, her feet were bound. She appeared to have ligature marks around her neck. Her stockings were pulled down just below thigh level, along with her underwear were pulled down along her legs also. She had a scarf stuffed into her mouth, which they called a babushka at the time. However, her clothing, which consisted of a blue jacket, wasn't dirty. It appeared that she had been placed there at the bottom of the pit.
And it was a very cold day. It was like 26 degrees. The original investigators were looking for any type of tangible physical evidence that they could have. They found a piece of insulation that had a footprint in it that was near the body. They collected that in the hopes that, hey, that could be something tangible. We could maybe compare that to a shoe of a potential suspect.
They realized that there was a tire track down in the refuse pit, and they actually casted that, which they'll pour a casting in, and then they'll raise the tire track out, and we kept that. At the time in 1964, DNA evidence didn't exist, so what they were looking for would be any type of blood evidence that may have been left by the perpetrator on the victim.
They also gathered all of the clothing that Maurice was wearing.
So the coroner did an autopsy, and they determined that Maurice was sexually assaulted. She was strangled and beaten. They also made a determination of a bruise on her abdomen, as if somebody had struck her very hard and it caused some damage to her intestines on the inside. So they listed the cause of death as homicide.
She was the Chivarella's child, but she could have been anybody's child.
It was a very dark time for the city. The day after this crime was reported, a lot of the kids were not allowed to go out in the yard by themselves anymore. Everybody was scared that their child would be next. Anybody that's going to sexually assault a small girl and then strangle her and leave her in a stripping pit in the cold and the snow is just a monster.
There was never a crime as heinous before in people's memory as the one that happened to Maurice Chivarella.
The day after Maurice was murdered, the family went to Catholic Mass because it was a day of obligation at the church. And then we went back home. And I remember we were nurturing each other, crying, embracing each other, because that was the only dynamic we felt was helping each other.
Police question Maurice's family, determined to find out all they can about the little girl.
They interviewed the father, they interviewed the mother of Maurice, they interviewed the brothers and sisters.
The Pennsylvania State Police had asked if they could speak with my father in private, and he said, fine. So I accompanied my father, and it was at that point that the state police started getting into more detail.
In any investigation, you want to go ahead and create a timeline. You want to establish a timeline to try to nail down when the crime occurred, when was the last time that you saw Maurice alive.
After interviewing them, they realized the timeline for Maurice leaving the residence was shortly after 8 a.m.
So the police were going ahead and contacting all the neighbors and people that lived within, I believe it was about a 5-city block area, to try to establish what route she took to school that day.
They spoke with Helen Slattery, who was a cousin to the Chivarella family. And that's when they were able to pinpoint more or less the 8:15 time frame of when she was last seen heading eastbound on 4th Street.
Everyone in Hazleton seems to have a theory about the murder.
In the absence of an answer, there were a number of rumors going around town as to who could have done something like that. Some people believed it had been someone local because of the intimate knowledge of our geography and finding that coal stripping pit, which would be only known to somebody locally.
I remember people wondering, was it one of our neighbors? That's what the scariest part was, not knowing who and what they might do next.
Investigators look for similar cases in nearby jurisdictions. One case immediately stands out.
There was a cold case that had occurred in October of 1962 in Bristol involving Carol Ann Doherty. She was a 9-year-old girl who was found beaten and sexually assaulted and strangled to death in a upstairs balcony of St. Mark's Church in Bristol.
The Bristol High School basketball team played a basketball game the night of the 17th of March, 1964.
There was that possibility that maybe somebody who had been at that basketball game could have been responsible for the Carol Ann Doherty homicide and now struck again in Hazleton. All of the students from Bristol who were absent the following day and who would have been of age to have committed such a crime, they were questioned. Their whereabouts were confirmed. The fans that had attended the game, who drove separately from the buses that were taking fans to and from Bristol, they were contacted, they were checked, they were cleared.
The Doherty case is unsolved, and police can't link it to the murder in Hazleton. Police then look at the people closest to Maurice.
Her father had owned a little grocery store called the Little Market. Somewhere in the customer group could have been a person of interest.
They asked him if he had any trouble with anybody at their grocery store on Alter Street, and Mr. Chivarella stated that there was a person that owed him some money and that he hadn't seen him in a while, and they had an issue where he had to remove him from the store at one point.
6 days after Maurice is laid to rest, police speak to the man mentioned by Maurice's father.
Bruce Hildebrand had a lot of problems with alcohol.
Supposedly he had passed some bad checks to the father, and investigators wanted him to submit to a polygraph. And on March 30th of 1964, Mr. Hildebrand called up the state police barracks and said, I don't want to give a polygraph. I want to make a confession and tell you what I did. Bruce Hildebrand was a person characterized as having a bad temper. He liked to drink. He lived close by to where the Chivarellas had resided.
600 North Mont, apartment 4, open 911 line.
29-year-old Hildebrand has already told police he has something to say about the 9-year-old's murder.
The police send a car over to his house. He voluntarily gets into the car, voluntarily says, take me to the barracks. And it's there that he gives a confession of sorts to the police.
He was reciting what he did and what happened during the crime. The report states that he's crying, he's sobbing, he's very remorseful.
He talks about having stolen his sister's car and coming across Maurice as she's walking to school and him offering her a ride and her accepting the ride. He provides a detail that says she was going to Mass that day. However, he didn't take her to school, didn't take her to Mass. He takes her to this abandoned dump.
It's clear to investigators, however, that Hildebrand has been drinking, and that's not the only problem.
He said that he strangled her to death utilizing her scarf. But it turned out that she had been strangled utilizing her own shoelaces.
Typically, you don't release all the information to the newspaper so that people have the intricate details of the case. Therefore, the only thing he was providing was the general information that was released to the public.
Hildebrand ultimately recants his confession.
And he chalked it up to being in a state of depression at the time, and that he figured what better way to be done away with than to admitting to this crime, and that would be the end of him. The original investigators in this case did a fantastic job of trying to leave no stone unturned. They were tracking down known sex offenders in the area.
In the middle of their investigation, one person stands out.
Harold Nicholas was one of those gentlemen who could have had immoral traits in the past.
The troopers at the time were given the information that Harold Nichols lived near the Chivarella residence and had a sexual deviant past, and that he may have frequented the areas of the stripping where Maurice was found. They interviewed him about some of his indiscretions in the past. They interviewed him about if he had any contact with the Chivarella family.
He provided a story that had some inconsistencies, and police had asked Mr. Nicholas to come voluntarily down to the state police headquarters in Hazleton and submit to a polygraph examination. Mr. Nicholas said that he would, and I believe he was supposed to appear on May 12th, 1964 at about 9 a.m. However, come 9 a.m. on May 12th, he doesn't show up.
And we got a report of a vehicle with a dead male in it near the stripping area where Maurice was found. Upon arrival to the scene, troopers identified the person as Harold Nichols, and it appeared that he had committed suicide.
And and the cause of death was determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning.
The belief was that Harold Nichols could have been the killer, because why would he commit suicide prior to coming in for the polygraph? And a lot of troopers believed that it was because he didn't want to have to confess to the crime.
Upon the death of Harold Nicholas, the state police collected several hair samples from his person, and they were entered into evidence for further potential use down the road.
By the end of 1964, leads in the case have dried up, and the case of the girl who left for school and never came home goes as cold as winter winds in Hazleton.
I know that there was frustration in me. I know there was frustration in my parents and siblings. Well, we want it to be solved.
My mother and father were both very faithful to their religion. We prayed that we'd find whoever did this.
I never gave up on Maurice's case.
They didn't know if whoever killed Maurice was still around and waiting to strike again. So for years, that was in the back of their heads. Parents became more protective of their children. So their worlds changed quite a bit. That's how this story became intergenerational.
The Chivarella family suffers another tragedy when Maurice's father dies in 2006.
When my father passed, it started me thinking of Maurice's case and questions that I've had. Like, why am I spending time on the person that murdered Maurice? He's already robbed so much of my conscious life.
Then, 43 years after the murder, the investigation is reignited with a major breakthrough.
With the advancement of technology, in 2007, our department went ahead and yet again sent out Maurice Chivarella's clothing. And it was finally in 2007 that they were able to locate seminal fluid on her blouse that she was wearing. From that stain, they were able to obtain a DNA profile for a potential suspect.
We knew about Maurice. We knew all these little details that made her who she was. Decades had passed, and in Hazleton, the community doesn't give up. We don't forget. We protect our kids.
Investigators, finally armed with DNA evidence, enter the sample into a national database.
In 2007, the suspect profile was checked against CODIS, and there was no match. Since there was no match in CODIS, either the individual had been deceased for quite some time, or they were never mandated to submit to a DNA sample as required by law.
Once again, the investigation grinds to a halt. In 2014, Ronald and Carmen lose their mother, Mary.
My mother shared something with us that astounded us by way of, I don't understand this. I don't know why it happened. I've lost Maurice. I only had her for 9 years. But you know, I'm so happy and so blessed to have had her for 9 years. That mindset of a blessing and looking at the positive aspects of Maurice's life versus all the horror that occurred.
Three years later, there's a new investigator and new hope.
I was assigned the case in the fall of 2017 upon the retirement of the then lead investigator, Corporal McAndrew. And when you see the massive size that this case file is, there's over 6,000 pages. Corporal McAndrew had been working potentially on acquiring this new technology where we could take a DNA sample, send it to a company, and they would be able to provide us with a snapshot, if you would, of an individual's ethnicity. The DNA wasn't sent out until May of 2018, and the report that we received back wasn't received until October of 2018.
Just after the 55th anniversary of Maurice's murder, police released the phenotype sketches to the media.
We had it posted as a 25-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 60-year-old.
The potential suspect was of Caucasian heritage, had either brown or black hair, with a high probability had green or hazel eyes.
Therefore, we could present that to the public and maybe jog anybody's memory of what this person looked like and what they may look like now as compared to at the time of the murder.
There were several tips that were received, I would say probably in upwards of around 30 that our department received.
Corporal Barron ran down every tip that we received. However, none of those tips panned out, and we were unable to identify any new suspect from that profile. And the disappointment was there, but we continued to move forward.
That forward movement comes in an email to Lieutenant Brutowski from an unlikely source.
It was February of 2020, and I was reading up on cold cases in Pennsylvania, and being that Hazleton is only about 80 miles from where I go to school, it was one of the first cases that came up online when I was looking. After reading the Maurice Chivarelli article, I just could not get this article off my mind. So I immediately said, okay, what if I just send them an email saying, hey, I've read that you were trying this. I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes, but here's who I am. Here's what I've been doing. If you think there's a chance I can help out with your case, I would love to do it. I was selling myself as a volunteer who wanted to help.
We met with Eric Schubert down at his college campus at a coffee shop, and he came prepared like it was a job interview. He had a resume. He had printouts of all of his accolades detailing the successes that he had had through his very short career. After the meeting, Lieutenant Brutowski made some phone calls, and the police departments that he reached out to said, Eric Schubert's the real deal. Our sample, our DNA profile, had been uploaded by this company to a publicly available genealogical database. And we provided that information to Mr. Schubert, who then started trying to put together family trees.
When I first got the DNA results, what really struck me was the top match was very distant.
And with that information, we were a bit worried that we would never get a relationship to the Hazleton area.
Eric Schubert, though, is just getting started.
I basically made a very calculated genealogical decision to focus on one side of the family that I thought could be promising as opposed to the other. And I was just digging into that family, digging into records. And as I did that, what happened was I actually ran into this large family that had Italian lineage.
Eric contacted me and said, hey, I found a pretty close relationship to the Hazleton area with this name of Palmetto. To know that we're potentially getting close, it feels real good.
I really enjoy finding the answer to a mystery, finding all those little pieces of evidence where, in the end, you sort of have that aha moment where all your work comes together into an answer.
When Mr. Schubert provided us with the Palmetto name, we knew that they were from the Weatherly area, which was just outside of Hazleton. We became very excited and thinking this could be our break in the case.
Discovering the name Palmetto is just the first step for Barron and Schubert.
Once we started narrowing in on this very large Italian family that had Hazleton connections, what we really had to do was just make sure that we had everyone, documented genealogically.
I went ahead and I did some research on the Palmetto family, and I located a family member whom had informed me that he had a detailed family tree for the Palmetto family and its off branches, and he was willing to provide that to me.
And that allowed us to say, okay, we have this family, we have all these people, now it's time to get some DNA samples and see if we're on the right track.
The more DNA we have, the better off we're going to be, and we could fine-tune our direction that we have to take this investigation.
Barron asks officers to help him speed up DNA collection.
I just remember Corporal Barron coming up to my desk and asking me if I'd be willing to assist him with the Shivarilla investigation. Corporal Barron and I were going out collecting DNA samples to include or exclude people. When we would get the results from those DNA samples, we would send them to the whiz kid, and he would tell us which way we needed to go after that.
There were times where I would say, okay, we have 30 people, and for us to move forward, here's what we need to do. So that would be an occasion where we might pause for 2 weeks and regroup and think about what the best plan is, and then come back to it and say, okay, we're, going to ask for this sample.
I think we worked very well together. I think we all knew each other's limitations at times, but at the end of the day, it was a good combination of good old-fashioned police work of us going knocking on doors, building rapport with people, and having them being willing to offer cooperation.
After more than a year of collecting data and narrowing their search, investigators get a break.
Eric was very confident that we were moving down the right path to solving this case.
We got a break in the case in the form of some publicly uploaded DNA samples in these few families that we had narrowed it down to. And we narrowed it down to sets of brothers.
4 potential individuals who were all related. 3 individuals were deceased. 1 individual was still alive.
Talking with the district attorney that was assisting us with the investigation, we had to get a DNA sample from the 1 remaining brother that was alive. Had we not gotten a DNA sample from that brother, it was believed that we did not have enough probable cause to exhume the body of the other brothers that were deceased. So in essence, all our chips were in the middle of the table when we went after the last DNA sample.
Trooper Quiros and I went down and met with the living individual, spoke with him. He was willing to provide a DNA sample. We obtained that DNA sample and sent that sample off to our DNA lab for processing. The results of that DNA test did not match the suspect profile that had been established in 2007.
So at this time, Corporal Barron and I and Schubert we're ecstatic. We had it narrowed down to 2 people.
1 brother had died several years ago. The other brother had died back in 1980. The brother that had died in 1980 had no known children, had no widow, nothing of that sort.
One of the brothers emerges as a suspect.
Corporal Barron and I did criminal history checks on both brothers, found that one of the brothers had an extensive criminal history to include a sexual assault that occurred in 1974. That was similar to the sexual assault and homicide which had occurred in 1964.
The team that we had assembled around us, we would have our conversations, and I think in our heart of hearts, we knew that there was one individual that was going to be our suspect.
The man's name is James Paul Fort.
We were 99% sure that James Fort was going to be our suspect in this homicide. When we got to the point where we had the two brothers left, we had the Chivarellas come into the office and we spoke to them about where we were, and they were elated.
The problem for investigators now, the two names on the list, Frank and James Fort, are deceased.
We get down to the two Fort brothers, one of whom was cremated, the other was buried. Corporal Barron and I focused on the brother that was cremated and went to that individual's widowed wife and requested any material she may have had that was left over from his demise. She provided us 2 hairbrushes and a razor that we were able to extract DNA from, sent that to the lab, and his DNA sample excluded him as a suspect for the known sample matched.
So after about 1.5 years of work, and after all those results, we came down to the one brother, one person, James Paul Fort.
To those who knew James Fort on a personal level, the way that they explained him was that he was a very nice person and that they would never have thought him to be capable of committing this type of crime. He was an Army veteran that served during the Cold War. He was a bartender.
Police discover that James Fort, who died of a heart attack more than 40 years earlier, had a dark side.
The more we researched into James Fort, we actually discovered a report from the 1970s where he was involved in a sexual assault of a woman.
There are a lot of similarities to the sexual assault in 1974 to the homicide that occurred in 1964. Both victims had been abducted on Alter Street, taken out to the strip-ins. They had been struck about their head and face area.
Still, one hurdle remains for investigators.
Okay, we have enough evidence here to show that it is probably him. However, he's been dead since 1980, and he does not have children. So how can we get his DNA?
We met with the district attorney's office. We obtained a search warrant to exhume Mr. Fort's body in order to extract DNA from his body and prove once and for all that he was the person responsible for Maurice's death. At the exhumation, we removed the tomb, brought it into a garage area, and the cemetery workers were having a hard time with the steel case that entombed the actual coffin itself. At one point, they were able to break open the metal tomb. They only broke it open about 2 inches, and we heard a loud metal clank. Everybody was looking around to see what had happened, and we looked down, and there was about a 6 to 8 inch by 4 inch crucifix that somehow made itself out of the 2-inch slit in the metal casing that surrounded the coffin. And we all looked at each other and thought to ourselves, that's a sign that we have this guy and this is going to be him.
On February 3rd, 2022, nearly 58 years after Marie Chivarella's murder, investigators get the answer they've been searching for.
We received the results from our DNA lab, and James Paul Fort matched the DNA profile from the semen stain on Marie Chivarella's jacket.
We're always told not to get attached to a case, but you can't help it. And it's a vivid memory for everybody who lived through this. And it's a vivid memory for everybody who grew up in this area.
I was numb because I knew all this was going on. I knew why we were there and didn't want to look at this person's face.
There was a sense of, I think, pride in that room.
I'll never stop praising the Pennsylvania State Police for the work they've done on Maurice's case for the last 58 years. Amazing. I don't hate the individual. The person did what he did, and it's up to a higher power than me to decide where it goes from there. I feel sorrow for his family, for what they're enduring right now. I wouldn't wish that on anyone.
I want people to know how wonderful my parents were, showing us that hate was not the way to go. Hate to them would have just destroyed us, and we just had love for each other, and that helped us get through all those years.
The night does not announce itself when it decides to swallow a life. It arrives quietly, like a held breath, like the moment between two heartbeats when something irreversible slips through. In New York, in the winter of 2003, there was such a night, one that would fracture a family, unsettle a neighborhood, and harden into a cold case that refused to fade. The city was loud as always, sirens echoing off brick and steel, taxis slicing through slush, apartment windows glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere between those lights and shadows, a person vanished, and with that disappearance came a question that would linger far longer than anyone expected. How does someone disappear in a city that never stops watching? The street was narrow, lined with brownstones that had survived decades of change. Snow had fallen earlier, thin and wet, just enough to soften footprints without erasing them entirely. A bodega on the corner kept its lights on all night, fluorescent and unforgiving, casting a pale rectangle across the sidewalk. Inside, the radio murmured sports scores and late-night talk, the clerk barely looking up as customers came and went. Outside, a security camera blinked red, recording everything and nothing at the same time. This was not a place where people expected mystery. This was routine, familiar, safe enough to stop paying attention. The missing person lived only a few blocks away. Friend would later say there was nothing unusual about that evening. No argument overheard, no frantic phone call, no sense of foreboding. Just a plan to step out briefly, to walk, to think, to clear the mind in the cold air. Coats were pulled tight, scarves wrapped high. The city hummed on, indifferent. By morning, that indifference would harden into alarm. When the call came in, it sounded like so many others. An adult, missing less than 24 hours. Not a runaway teenager. Not a child. No immediate signs of foul play. The dispatcher typed it in, tagged it, forwarded it. In a city drowning in emergencies, this one barely caused a ripple. Officers knocked on doors, asked routine questions, wrote down times and descriptions. When did you last see them? What were they wearing? Any reason they wouldn't come home? The answers were ordinary. Too ordinary. That was the first unsettling thing. As hours stretched into days, the ordinary began to crack. The phone never rang. The bank account went untouched. No subway swipes. No credit card charges. No digital footprint in a city obsessed with movement. Flyers appeared on lampposts and storefronts. A face frozen in a photograph that suddenly felt like it belonged to another era. Have you seen me? The eyes seemed to ask. People glanced, frowned, moved on. New York has always been good at moving on. Detectives began retracing the last known steps. The route was short, almost trivial. A straight walk past familiar buildings, past the bodega, toward a small park that cut through the block like a darkened lawn. In daylight, it was harmless. At night, it became something else. Patches of shadow, bare trees rattling in the wind, benches slick with ice. Search teams combed it carefully, flashlights cutting cones through the darkness. They found nothing. No dropped glove. No scuff marks that told a story. Just snow, already melting, already erasing. The community reacted the way communities do when fear seeps in through the cracks. Parents walked children to school. Shop owners closed earlier. Conversations lowered when strangers passed. Everyone replayed their own routines in their heads, wondering where danger might be hiding. Rumors bloomed and spread, then died when they couldn't sustain themselves. A suspicious a shadowy figure, a scream no one could quite remember hearing. Each rumor left behind a residue of unease. Investigators widened the net. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby stores, subway entrances, traffic cameras. Hours of grainy video flickered across screens in dim rooms. People passed by, bundled and anonymous, faces blurred by motion and low resolution. The missing person appeared once, briefly, walking with purpose, head down against the cold. Then nothing. No clear break. No obvious moment when everything went wrong. It was as if the city itself had opened and closed without leaving a seam. Witnesses came forward hesitantly. A dog walker who thought they'd seen someone matching the description near the park entrance. A cab driver who wondered, days later, if a passenger might have been the same person. Each lead sounded promising for a moment, then dissolved under scrutiny. Times didn't line up. Details shifted. Memory proved unreliable under pressure. Detectives marked boxes, drew arrows, crossed things out. The board filled and emptied again. The family sat in a small apartment that felt suddenly too quiet. Every sound, a creaking pipe, a passing car, carried the weight of expectation. They replayed conversations, searched for hidden meanings in casual remarks. Had there been stress at work? A disagreement they hadn't taken seriously? A plan not mentioned? Grief hovered, not yet fully formed, suspended by the hope that tomorrow might bring a phone call, a knock at the door. That hope is a strange thing. It can sustain and torture at the same time. Weeks passed. Media attention flared briefly, then drifted elsewhere. Another story took its place, then another. The case file thickened, but progress did not. Detectives faced the uncomfortable reality that there was no crime scene to process, no body to speak for itself, no clear suspect to interrogate. Everything hinged on absence, on what wasn't there. In the language of law enforcement, that absence has a name that chills families when they hear it. Cold case. Still, they pushed. Background checks. Interviews with coworkers, neighbors, acquaintances. Everyone insisted the same thing. Nothing seemed wrong. That sameness became suspicious in itself. Someone always knows something. Someone always sees something. Or so they tell themselves. But sometimes, knowledge scatters into fragments too small to assemble. The city changed as months slid into years. Buildings were renovated, businesses replaced, faces aged. The missing person's photograph yellowed slightly at the edges where it had been taped and retaped. New detectives reviewed the file with fresh eyes, looking for what others might have missed. They questioned assumptions. They mapped alternative routes. They revisited the park at night, standing where the footprints might have been, listening to the wind. They felt the same frustration, the same pull of unanswered questions. There were moments, sharp, fleeting, when hope surged again. A reported sighting in another borough. A name flagged in a database. A piece of evidence re-examined with newer technology. Each time, anticipation spiked. Each time, it fell away. The case resisted closure, as if determined to remain a wound rather than a scar. For the community, the disappearance became a quiet legend. People referenced it in half-sentences, as warnings, as examples. Remember what happened back in 2003? It served as proof that the city's bright lights could not banish every shadow. Parents used it to hurry children home. Neighbors locked doors a little earlier. Fear settled into routine. And yet, the case did not disappear entirely. It lingered in filing cabinets, in the memories of those who had searched and waited, in the unanswered messages on an old voicemail system. It lingered in the question that never stopped being asked, even when it was no longer spoken aloud. Somewhere between the last confirmed sighting and the endless stretch of time that followed, something had happened. Something simple or something monstrous. Something hidden in plain sight. That is how a cold case breathes. Quietly, patiently. It waits while years pass and certainty erodes. It waits while lives move forward with an empty space carved into them. In New York, the city kept moving, relentless and loud, but beneath that motion lay a silence that no amount of noise could fill. A silence shaped like a person who never came home, and a night that never gave back what it took. Time does not heal a disappearance. It only changes the way it hurts. By the second year, the case no longer sat on the front desk. It lived in a metal drawer, labeled, numbered, reduced to paper and plastic sleeves. But outside that drawer, life continued to collide with the absence. Birthdays arrived and passed without phone calls. Holidays came with an extra chair no one dared to remove. In the city, seasons rotated with mechanical precision, yet the unanswered question remained suspended, untouched by weather or logic. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning carried it with them like a low-grade fever. They would be in the middle of another investigation, another apartment, another body, another set of facts, and suddenly, uninvited, the image would return. A face from a flyer, a walk down a snowy block, a gap in time that refused to close. Cold cases have a way of doing that. They linger at the edge of thought, waiting for weakness. The file was revisited systematically. Phone records were re-examined, line by line, call durations scrutinized for patterns that might have been overlooked. Emails were read again, stripped of context, words weighed for hidden meaning. Investigators questioned whether something had been misread from the start. What if the disappearance wasn't random? What if it wasn't sudden? What if the night was merely the end point of something already in motion? Coworkers were called back in, years later, surprised by the sound of the same questions. Some had moved on to new jobs, new cities, new lives. Memories had softened. Timelines blurred. Small details surfaced too late to be verified. A strange mood in the weeks before. A vague mention of stress. A sense that something was being carried quietly. None of it solid enough to anchor a theory, but enough to keep suspicion alive. The part came under renewed focus. On paper, it was insignificant. In reality, it was a funnel, a place where paths narrowed, where light thinned, where witnesses became scarce. Crime analysts mapped incidents in the surrounding blocks, looking for clusters, spikes, patterns in the years before and after. Assaults, robberies, unreported altercations. The maps suggested nothing definitive, only possibility. Possibility is dangerous. It invites imagination where evidence fails. There was talk of a serial offender. Not loudly, not officially, but in the way professionals test an idea without naming it. Other disappearances were compared, faces lined up on a wall, similarities debated. Age, build, time of day, location. Each match raised hope, then collapsed under closer inspection. The city produces coincidences at scale. Not every pattern is a predator. The family learned to live inside uncertainty. They became experts in waiting, in managing the oscillation between hope and resignation. Every ring of the phone triggered the same physical response, a tightening in the chest, a held breath followed by the same letdown. Friends struggled to know what to say. There are no rehearsed lines for a loss without proof. Sympathy cards stop coming. Silence fills the gap. Years passed, and with them came technological change. Databases grew. Algorithms sharpened. Evidence once considered mute was given a chance to speak. The case benefited from this progress, at least in theory. Old footage was enhanced. Frames were stabilized, faces sharpened pixel by pixel. Investigators watched the same clips again, slower now, searching for movement that didn't belong. A head turning too deliberately. A figure lingering too long. They found nothing that crossed the line from curiosity to cause. Anonymous tips trickled in sporadically. Some are earnest, others cruel. People claimed visions, confessions overheard in bars, secrets revealed on deathbeds. Each tip was logged, assessed, chased as far as resources allowed. Most led nowhere. A few led somewhere briefly, then stopped. The pattern repeated, so often it developed a rhythm. Receive. Hope. Investigate. Close. One tip, however, refused to die easily. It came years after the disappearance, stripped of emotion, written plainly. It suggested the missing person had been seen with someone familiar, someone who had never officially been considered suspect. The name meant little at first. A peripheral figure, someone adjacent but forgettable. Investigators debated whether it was worth reopening old interviews. Time had passed. Alibis had calcified, but cold cases survive on discomfort. The decision was made. The interview room looked the same as it always had. Neutral walls, a table scarred by decades of nervous hands. The individual sat calmly, answering questions with practiced ease. Nothing obvious broke the surface. No tremor, no contradiction, but something in the cadence lingered with the detectives afterward. A pause too long, a detail volunteered unnecessarily, enough to provoke unease, not enough to justify action. That unease spread quietly. Investigators began to re-examine social connections that had once seemed harmless. Who knew whom? Who crossed paths without leaving records? The missing person's life was reconstructed through other people's memories, a fragile mosaic held together by secondhand impressions. The picture that emerged was incomplete but human. Someone who existed fully, then abruptly stopped. The community, largely unaware of these renewed efforts, continued to carry the case as a ghost story with no ending. New residents moved into old buildings, oblivious to what had happened on their block years before. Others remembered too well. They measured time by the absence, marking anniversaries no one else acknowledged. Trauma does not require constant attention to remain active. As the investigation stretched further into the past, fatigue set in. Resources shifted to cases with bodies, suspects, deadlines. The cold case unit fought for relevance, arguing that time did not erase responsibility. They knew the odds. Most cold cases do not end with answers. They end with boxes archived, questions unanswered, families learning to coexist with doubt. And yet, something about this case resisted burial. Perhaps it was the simplicity of the disappearance. Perhaps it was the way the city had swallowed someone whole without explanation. Or perhaps it was the feeling, shared but rarely voiced, that the truth was close enough to sense, just beyond reach. A wrong turn taken, a door not knocked on, a name not spoken soon enough. Late at night, in offices emptied of noise, detectives would pull the file one more time. Cold cases survive because they are unfinished sentences. They demand an ending even when none is forthcoming. In New York, 2003 never fully let go. It remained embedded in the city's memory, a year that did not resolve cleanly, a disappearance that refused to be reduced to statistics. The file stayed open, not because answers were guaranteed, but because letting it close felt like surrender. By the third decade, the case had developed weight. Not the kind measured in pages or evidence bags, but the kind that settles into people. Detectives rotated out, retired, passed the file like an heirloom no one wanted to inherit yet couldn't abandon. Each new set of eyes arrived with confidence, with the belief that distance from the original investigation might reveal what proximity had obscured. And each time, the case pushed back, stubborn and opaque, daring them to prove it wrong. The city had learned new habits. Cameras multiplied, algorithms learned faces, data became something you could drown in. In theory, disappearances should have become harder. In practice, this one remained a blind spot. Investigators fed old footage into new systems, letting software comb for matches against modern databases. The process was clinical, almost hopeful. Machines, after all, do not tire or forget. But machines only see what they are shown. They flagged similarities, generated probabilities, then fell silent. The missing person remained a ghost outside the frame. Attention returned to the timeline. Not the broad strokes, but the minutes. The narrow window between the last confirmed sighting and the moment concern hardened into panic. Analysts reconstructed it second by second. Weather reports, transit schedules, light levels, foot traffic patterns. The night itself became a suspect, interrogated through data. It offered nothing definitive, only the same unsettling truth. The disappearance had occurred quickly, efficiently, without spectacle. There are theories, of course. There are always theories. An opportunistic crime, random and brutal. A targeted encounter, personal and deliberate. An accident followed by panic and concealment. Each theory had supporters, each had holes. None could be elevated to fact. The absence of a body was both mercy and curse. It preserved hope while denying proof. It allowed every possibility to survive, equally unprovable. The anonymous tip resurfaced during this phase, dragged back into the light by persistence rather than promise. Investigators reread it carefully, now with years of context. The phrasing was still flat, still controlled. No emotional bleed through. No embellishment. It suggested familiarity, not rumor. The question shifted from whether it was true to why it had been sent at all. What compelled someone, after so many years, to speak indirectly? Fear, guilt, boredom, or something simpler. The belief that enough time had passed. The person named in the tip had aged visibly since the original interviews. Hair thinner, movement slower, life etched into posture. When detectives approached again, the reaction was irritation mixed with disbelief. This again, the answers remained consistent, rehearsed by repetition. Alibis were reinforced by years of retelling. Friends who once supported them now hesitated, unsure whether their own memories were accurate or merely familiar. Time had done its work, smoothing edges, erasing friction. Investigators attempted pressure from another angle. Financial records were expanded, not just from the time of the disappearance, but from the years that followed. Sudden changes, unexplained gains or losses, patterns that might suggest panic or preparation. What they found was unremarkable. Ordinary debt, ordinary income, the quiet predictability of a life that appeared untouched by catastrophe. It was infuriating in its normalcy. Meanwhile, the family aged into a different kind of endurance. Their grief lost sharpness but gained density. They learned how to speak about the missing person in the past tense without finality, a linguistic compromise that mirrored their reality. They attended meetings with detectives, nodded through explanations, asked the same questions in different words. Each meeting ended the same way, with promises to keep looking, to keep the file open, to keep hope alive. Hope became less a feeling and more discipline. The case entered training materials, cited as an example of investigative limits. New recruits studied it, debated it, offered solutions in classrooms far removed from the original street. They spoke confidently, unburdened by the years of failure. I would have done this differently. I would have focused there. Their instructors let them talk. Experience would teach them humility soon enough. At street level, the neighborhood barely resembled its former self. The bodega had changed ownership twice. The park had new lighting, new benches, a playground where there had once been shadow. Safety initiatives were touted, statistics improved. Parents felt reassured. And yet, for those who remembered, the unease never fully left. Improvement does not erase memory. It only paints over it. There were moments when the case seemed to stir on its own. A body discovered elsewhere sparked brief speculation before being ruled out. A confession in an unrelated case prompted hurried cross-checks. A journalist dug through archives, reigniting public interest for a few days. Each surge ended the same way, with disappointment settling back in a place like dust. Investigators debated whether the case had been too small, too quiet. No dramatic struggle, no witnesses screaming, no blood to demand attention. In a city conditioned to respond to spectacle, subtlety can be fatal. The disappearance slipped between systems designed to react, not to search patiently. That realization carried a quiet accusation, one no one wanted to voice. As years accumulated, the case took on a different role. It became a mirror. To detectives, it reflected the limits of method and persistence. To the family, it reflected the cruelty of unresolved endings. To the city, it reflected the uncomfortable truth that even with eyes everywhere, some things vanish completely. It challenged the belief that progress guarantees safety. Late one evening, a detective nearing retirement sat alone with the file, aware that it might be the last time. The office hummed with distant activity, but their desk was still. They traced the timeline once more, not looking for facts, but for feeling. They imagined the cold air in the lungs, the crunch of snow, the weight of the city pressing close. They wondered if the missing person had sensed the shift, the moment when routine gave way to danger, or if it had all happened too fast for awareness. Cold cases do not end cleanly. They fray. They unravel at the edges. They become stories told without conclusions, questions passed down like inheritance. In New York, the year 2003 remained incomplete, a chapter missing its final page. The disappearance endured not because it was spectacular, but because it was ordinary. And that ordinariness, stripped of explanation, became its own kind of horror. The city continued to pulse, louder than memory, faster than regret. But beneath the rhythm, the silence persisted, patient and unresolved. Somewhere within it lay the truth, unmoved by time, waiting for the moment, if it ever came, when someone would finally speak clearly enough to be heard. The case entered a phase investigators rarely admit exists, a long corridor where effort continues but belief thins. Not gone, not abandoned, just stretched so far it becomes fragile. Files were digitized, then redigitized, migrating from cabinets to servers, from servers to cloud storage, each transition promising clarity and delivering only preservation. The facts remained unchanged, stubborn in their simplicity. A walk, a night, a disappearance. Everything else was inference layered on top of silence. What changed were the people. The original detectives had voices now softened by age, their memories textured by hundreds of other cases. When asked about 2003, they paused longer than before, reaching past decades of noise to locate the correct file in their minds. They remembered the frustration more clearly than the details. Frustration has a way of imprinting itself. It lingers after names and dates blur. A cold case review board took interest, the kind assembled when a case refuses to die quietly. Analysts, psychologists, forensic specialists, all outsiders, all convinced distance would be their advantage. They approached the file without reverence, questioning choices once considered obvious. Why that route? Why that assumption? Why trust that witness? The exercise was clinical, almost surgical. It stripped the case of sentiment and put it under bright, impersonal light. One recurring question surfaced repeatedly. Motive, not just for a hypothetical perpetrator, but for the disappearance itself. People vanish for reasons, even when those reasons are hidden. The board examined the missing person's life again, this time searching for stressors that might not register as red flags individually, but could accumulate quietly. Work pressures, financial strain, personal conflicts kept private. The picture that emerged was still incomplete, but less pristine than it had once seemed. Ordinary lives carry invisible weight. Psychological profiling entered the discussion, not in the dramatic sense popularized by television, but in careful probabilities. If this was an opportunistic crime, what type of offender would strike in that location, at that hour? If it was targeted, what kind of relationship could exist without leaving a trace? If it was voluntary disappearance, what personality traits would support such a choice? Each profile produced plausible narratives. None could be confirmed. The park was reimagined through this lens, not just as geography, but as behavior space. Who uses it at night? Who avoids it? Who feels ownership of it? Maintenance logs were reviewed, lighting schedules, security patrol routes. The gaps were obvious in hindsight. Shadows had been plentiful, visibility limited. It was the kind of place where intent could hide comfortably. One analyst proposed an uncomfortable idea, that the disappearance might have been witnessed but not recognized as such. A brief interaction misread as mundane. A figure following another, just close enough to seem coincidental. In a city trained to mind its own business, ambiguity is often ignored. The idea resonated because it required no villainous mastermind, only timing and indifference. Public outreach was attempted again, carefully framed. Not a plea, but a reminder. Media segments aired late at night, the footage repackaged with updated graphics and restrained narration. The response was modest. A handful of calls, familiar claims, a few new voices, uncertain, apologetic. People wondered aloud if something they'd seen years ago might matter now. Investigators listened patiently, knowing that memory degrades unevenly, preserving emotion while losing accuracy. Among the calls was one that echoed the earlier anonymous tip without repeating it. Different words, same implication. The suggestion of familiarity, of a connection overlooked. Investigators compared the two, aligning phrases, searching for overlap. The writing styles differed, but the core idea matched too closely to dismiss. It hinted at a shared source of knowledge, or at least a shared belief. The question became whether belief alone could sustain a rumor for years without grounding. They returned, again, to the peripheral figure named before. Time had not softened suspicion. It had complicated it. Alibis built on memory, rather than documentation, weakened with age. People who once vouched confidently now hedged, unsure if their recollections were anchored in reality or repetition. Investigators probed gently, aware that aggressive tactics could collapse cooperation entirely. They were threading a needle with blunt instruments. The interviews yielded no confession, no breakthrough, but they left behind a residue of doubt that could not be scrubbed away. The individual's life trajectory was examined more closely. Moves that coincided with investigative milestones. Relationships that ended abruptly. Nothing criminal, nothing actionable, but enough to unsettle those looking for certainty. Suspicion, once introduced, is difficult to contain. For the family, these developments were a double-edged blade. Renewed attention offered the possibility of answers, but also reopened wounds that had scarred imperfectly. They learned to temper expectation, to receive updates without leaning into them too hard. They had lived too long with disappointment to surrender fully to hope. And yet they listened. They always listened. The city marked time differently now. The events of 2003 felt distant to most, archived alongside other unresolved moments. New crises commanded attention. New tragedies demanded grief. But cold cases operate on a slower clock. They wait for alignment of technology, of memory, of conscience. They survive on patience rather than urgency. A former detective, long retired, agreed to speak with investigators one last time. He had carried the case with him, he said, not actively, but like a stone in a pocket. He recalled a minor detail that had never made it into the file, dismissed at the time as irrelevant. A comment from a witness about a vehicle idling longer than expected. No plate number. No description precise enough to act on. Just a feeling that something had been off. The detail was logged now, years too late to verify. Still, it altered the texture of the narrative. It suggested movement, waiting intent. The board reconvened, folding this fragment into their models. It fit several theories uncomfortably well. An opportunistic encounter facilitated by familiarity with the area. A moment of hesitation mistaken for coincidence. Again, plausibility without proof. The case seemed to exist permanently in that space. As the review concluded, recommendations were issued. Keep the file active. Prioritize familial connections and peripheral figures. Monitor similar cases for emerging patterns. It was a roadmap without a destination. Investigators accepted it with the weary professionalism of those accustomed to incomplete victories. In the quiet that followed, the case settled back into its familiar state. Not dormant, not alive, but waiting. Waiting for the call that would sound different. Waiting for the detail that would refuse to be ignored. Waiting for time to loosen a tongue or sharpen a memory. Cold cases endure because time is both their enemy and their ally. In New York, the streets where the disappearance occurred continued to host ordinary lives. People laughed, argued, hurried past one another without noticing the history beneath their feet. But beneath the layers of renovation and routine, the night of 2003 remained intact, preserved in the absence it created. A single walk that never reached its end. a question that refused to settle, and a truth that, despite everything, remained just out of reach, breathing quietly in the dark. The case did not erupt back into consciousness. It crept. It re-entered through side doors and quiet conversations, through updates slipped into agendas and notes added to margins. What changed was not the evidence, but the atmosphere around it. The longer a cold case lives, the more it attracts a particular kind of attention, the kind that comes from people who believe time loosens what fear once tightened. Detectives learned to recognize that shift. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A new wave of information began to arrive, not in bursts but in drips. Tips framed cautiously, almost apologetically. I'm not sure this matters. I didn't think it meant anything back then. The language was hesitant, shaped by years of silence. Investigators listened differently now. They had learned that the truth rarely announces itself cleanly. It circles first, testing the ground. One call stood out for its restraint. The caller did not speculate. They did not accuse. They described an interaction from years earlier, brief and forgettable at the time, now heavy with second-guessing. A conversation overheard, a name mentioned casually, then dropped. The kind of moment people replay only after something terrible happens. The caller had moved away, built a life elsewhere, but the memory had followed, resurfacing whenever the case appeared in the news. It had taken years to decide whether to speak. Investigators traced the details carefully, aware of how memory bends under the weight of hindsight. Still, the account aligned uncomfortably well with existing suspicions. Not enough to act on its own. Enough to shift priorities. The circle narrowed, slowly, deliberately, as if afraid of collapsing too soon. Attention returned, again, to the figure who had hovered at the edges of the investigation for years. Peripheral no longer felt like the right word. This was someone woven loosely into the missing person's life, close enough to know routines, distant enough to escape scrutiny. Someone who understood the neighborhood, the shortcuts, the rhythms of night. Someone whose name appeared often enough to feel familiar, but never prominently enough to alarm. Surveillance was not an option. Too much time had passed. Instead, investigators observed indirectly. They mapped behavior retrospectively, reconstructing movements through receipts, phone pings, social interactions long since archived. Patterns emerged that were not incriminating, but curious. Gaps where records should have been. Overlaps where stories diverged. Nothing dramatic. Just enough friction to slow the narrative and force attention. The interviews resumed, spaced out, low pressure. Questions were framed as clarifications, not challenges. Investigators wanted to see what surfaced unprompted. People reveal more when they believe they are correcting rather than defending. The responses were consistent, but consistency can be rehearsed. The tone was calm, but calm can be cultivated. Detectives took note of what was said and what was not. In parallel, forensic options were revisited. Advances had rendered some techniques obsolete, others newly viable. Evidence once dismissed as too degraded was reconsidered. Items stored for decades were unpacked carefully, handled like artifacts. The process was slow, methodical, constrained by the reality that time erodes not just memory, but material. Still, there was hope. Hope thrives on possibility, no matter how slim. The family was informed, cautiously. Investigators had learned to underpromise. Updates were factual, stripped of speculation. Even so, the news landed with force. After years of stasis, motion itself felt dangerous. The family braced for impact, emotional muscles tightening reflexively. They had been here before. They knew how quickly momentum could evaporate. Public awareness flickered again. A short segment, a digital article, social media chatter that rose and fell within days. Armchair analysts dissected theories, confident and detached. The family avoided it. Detectives tolerated it. Public interest is a tool, but a blunt one. It generates noise alongside information. Sifting becomes harder. Behind closed doors, the case began to feel different. Not solved, not even close, but altered, as if a long-held assumption had shifted changing the angle of every other piece. Investigators revisited the night itself with renewed focus. Not just where the missing person went, but who might have expected them, who knew they would be there, who benefited from predictability. They considered motive again, this time less abstract. Motive does not require malice. It can grow from resentment, desperation, fear. It can ignite in moments of perceived loss of control. Investigators examine relationships through this lens, searching for imbalance. Power dynamics, emotional dependency, unspoken tensions that might surface under the right conditions. One theory gained quiet traction, not discussed openly, but acknowledged through action. It suggested the disappearance was not random, not the work of a stranger lurking in the dark. It proposed familiarity, proximity, and a moment that escalated faster than anyone intended. An encounter that began ordinary and ended irrevocably. The kind of scenario people spend lifetimes trying to bury. This theory explained certain things. The absence of witnesses, the lack of struggle, the efficiency of disappearance. It did not explain everything. No theory did, but it fit enough pieces to demand attention. Investigators began constructing a psychological timeline alongside the physical one. They asked not just what happened, but when realization might have dawned, when fear might have taken hold, when decisions might have been made under pressure. They studied past behavior for signs of stress following the disappearance, sudden changes in routine, emotional volatility, attempts to distance or distract. Again, nothing conclusive. Again, enough to unsettle. The case reached a point where certainty felt closer and farther at the same time. Leads converged, then stopped just short of collision. Each step forward revealed another barrier. Legal thresholds loomed large. Suspicion is not proof. Patterns are not evidence. Time had granted perspective, but it had also stolen leverage. A senior investigator articulated what many felt, but few said. If this breaks, they noted, it won't be because we found something new. It'll be because someone lets go of something old. Confessions, after all, are rarely spontaneous. They are negotiated internally over years, eroded by guilt, fear, or exhaustion. The case was no longer about searching the city. It was about waiting for a human moment. The waiting resumed, but it was different now. Sharper, more attentive. Investigators monitored developments quietly, alert to shifts that might seem insignificant to others. A move, a hospitalization, a death in the extended circle. Life events that alter the calculus of silence. For the family, the renewed focus reopened conversations they had learned to avoid. They spoke again about possibilities they had once dismissed as unthinkable. The idea that the answer might be known by someone they had trusted was a wound layer to top the original loss. Betrayal complicates grief. It fractures it. As the year turned, the case approached an anniversary that carried weight not because of its number, but because of its endurance. 2 decades without resolution. 2 decades of unanswered questions echoing in a city that prides itself on exposure. Detectives prepared statements carefully, aware of the symbolic power of time. They avoided promises. They emphasized commitment. Word mattered. Cold cases do not resolve on schedules. They rupture. They collapse inward or explode outward. The tension lies in not knowing which will come first. In New York, the disappearance from 2003 had entered a critical phase, not because the truth was known, but because it was close enough to feel dangerous. The silence around it had thinned. The space for denial had narrowed. Somewhere, someone carried the weight of that night alone. Whether through guilt, fear, or simple habit, they had kept it contained for years. Investigators understood this now more than ever. They waited not with hope, but with readiness. Because when a cold case finally shifts, it does not whisper. It cracks. The pressure did not arrive as a knock on the door. It seeped in. It arrived through awareness, through the subtle understanding that the margins for silence were shrinking. Investigators felt it first. They had seen this phase before in other cases, the point where a long-held secret begins to resist the person keeping it. Behavior changes. Edges fray. Routine slips. The case had not broken yet, but it was beginning to lean. The peripheral figure noticed it too, even if they never admitted it aloud. Questions resurfaced more often now, framed politely, persistently. Names from the past were spoken again, as if they had never been set aside. The interviews were still cordial, still voluntary, but the tone had shifted. There was less room to redirect, fewer places to hide behind familiarity. Time, once an ally, was becoming unreliable. Investigators focused on moments of stress, not the night itself, but the aftermath. They mapped life events following the disappearance, looking for deviations that coincided too neatly with the timeline. Sudden changes rarely prove anything on their own, but they can reveal fractures. A move that felt rushed, a job change without explanation, a relationship that ended abruptly, not with conflict, but with withdrawal. Each detail was weighed carefully, placed into a broader context that had taken years to assemble. The city, indifferent as ever, provided cover. Millions of people change their lives every year in New York. Reinvention is not suspicious here. It is expected. That reality had protected the case's central mystery for years, but also created contrast. Against the background noise of constant motion, certain choices stood out more clearly when examined closely. A breakthrough did not come from the streets or the archives. It came from a conversation that was never meant to matter. A casual remark made years earlier, now remembered differently by someone who had grown older, less certain, more reflective. The person who recalled it did not frame it as evidence. They framed it as discomfort. A sentence that had felt wrong even then, delivered too quickly with a nervous laugh. At the time, it had been dismissed as awkwardness. Now it felt like something else. Investigators listened, and then they listened again. They compared the phrasing to past statements, searching for echoes. They found them. Not verbatim, but tonal. Defensive before accusation. Explanatory before question. These were not confessions. They were signals. The kind that suggests someone has been rehearsing a version of events long enough to forget where it begins. The cold case unit convened quietly. No announcements. No press. They reviewed what they had. Timelines aligned. Behavioral anomalies clustered. Tips converging toward the same narrow band of familiarity. It was not enough to act, but it was enough to prepare. Preparation became the focus. If the case moved, it would move fast. Years of patience would compress into days. Legal constraints hovered over every discussion. Prosecutors reminded investigators of the standard they would eventually need to meet. Juries do not convict on vibes or patterns. They require proof or something close enough to hold its shape under pressure. Circumstantial cases can succeed, but only when built meticulously. The absence of a body complicated everything. The absence of a clear crime scene complicated it further. The case would need something human. A voice, a contradiction, a moment where silence cracked. Investigators adjusted strategy accordingly. They stopped chasing the city and focused on the circle. Not aggressively, patiently. They knew the weight of being watched, even subtly, could alter behavior. People under long-term pressure make mistakes, not dramatic ones, but small slips. A timeline misremembered, a detail volunteered without prompting, a correction offered too quickly. The interviews became more frequent, though never intrusive. The peripheral figure complied, maintaining composure, answering questions with the same practice consistency. But consistency has a texture, and investigators sensed it thinning. Answers arrived a beat too late, as if checked internally before release. Eye contact wavered at unexpected moments. The changes were slight, but they accumulated. Meanwhile, forensic specialists delivered updates that were disappointing but clarifying. Old evidence yielded no definitive results. The passage of time had done what it always does. It erased, but also narrowed possibilities. Certain scenarios were effectively ruled out. Certain theories lost plausibility. The disappearance was increasingly difficult to frame as random. The shape of the case sharpened, even as its center remained hollow. The family felt the shift without fully understanding it. Updates came with a different cadence now, more careful, more deliberate. Investigators avoided saying too much, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for how fragile momentum can be. The family sensed restraint and interpreted it cautiously. Hope stirred, then settled, contained by experience. Outside the investigation, life events began to intersect unpredictably. A medical emergency, a hospitalization within the extended circle. Illness has a way of altering priorities, of forcing reflection. Investigators took note, not with anticipation, but with awareness. Mortality changes people. It loosens some tongues and tightens others. The case's anniversary approached again, and with it, renewed attention. This time, investigators were more deliberate in how they engaged. They released minimal information, emphasizing longevity rather than speculation. The message was subtle but clear. The case was alive. Someone, somewhere, heard it and reacted. Investigators noticed the reaction not in words, but in behavior. A routine check-in was scheduled, then rescheduled. A minor delay, explained away easily. But delays matter when they break patterns. The interview that eventually took place was unremarkable on the surface. Questions asked, answers given. But afterward, detectives compared notes and agreed something had shifted. The narrative, once smooth, now required effort. The story no longer flowed. It had to be carried. This was the danger zone. Push too hard, and silence would harden permanently. Ease off, and momentum would dissipate. Investigators chose balance. They maintained presence without pressure, letting the weight of years do its work. They trusted that the truth, if held long enough, becomes heavier than the fear of releasing it. Late one night, a detective reviewed the case alone, not for strategy, but for understanding. They read statements as if they were literature, searching for voice, for inconsistency in tone rather than fact. They noticed how certain phrases appeared again and again, almost reflexively. They wondered when those phrases had been born, on the night itself, or later, as protection. Cold cases teach a particular lesson. Resolution rarely arrives as revelation. It arrives as erosion. Certainty wears away at denial. Memory presses against fabrication. The case was entering that phase. No silence, no headlines, just pressure, steady and unyielding. Investigators prepared contingency plans. If someone spoke, they needed to be ready to listen without interrupting, to capture nuance without contaminating it. Confessions are fragile things. Mishandled, they collapse. Handled carefully, they can unlock years of silence. The city moved on, unaware that the long still case was beginning to flex. Streets filled. Nights passed. People disappeared into routine, trusting in the comfort of normalcy. Beneath that normalcy, the night from 2003 shifted slightly, as if disturbed by movement above it. Somewhere, a decision was forming. Not yet articulated, not yet conscious, but inevitable. The cost of holding the secret was rising. Sleep grew thinner. The past pressed closer. Investigators could not see this directly, but they sensed it. Cold cases do not end with certainty. They end with surrender. The question was no longer whether the silence would break, but how. And when it did, whether the truth that emerged would finally be enough to withstand the years it had spent buried. The shift was quiet enough that it could have been missed by anyone not trained to notice the absence of noise. No dramatic confession, no frantic call in the night, just a series of small choices that no longer aligned the way they used to. Investigators recognized it as the beginning of an end, though they could not yet name its shape. When secrets near the point of collapse, they rarely explode. They sag, they bend, they start to leak around the edges. The peripheral figure became more careful, which paradoxically made them more visible. Messages were returned faster, then slower. Availability fluctuated without explanation. Conversations grew more guarded, less conversational. Where once answers flowed easily, now they arrived trimmed, cautious, as if every word had a pass inspection before being released. This was not proof, but it was pressure made visible. Investigators adjusted their posture. They stopped seeking contradictions and began documenting deviations. Not what changed dramatically, but what changed subtly. A detail once volunteered, now withheld. A timeline once recited smoothly, now recounted with effort. They noted when clarification was offered unprompted, when explanations arrived too early. These moments mattered because they revealed rehearsal. And rehearsal suggests fear of forgetting the script. The cold case unit consulted behavioral analysts again, not for profiles, but for thresholds. How long does someone typically hold a secret like this? What events accelerate disclosure? The answers were never precise, but patterns emerged. Illness, loss, aging. The realization that time is no longer an abstract concept, but a narrowing corridor. People reassess what they can carry and what they cannot. A significant life event landed within the extended circle, unrelated to the case, yet impossible to ignore. Investigators did not exploit it. They observed. Stress reshapes priorities. It rearranges fear. The calculus of risk changes when the future feels shorter than the past. Silence, once protective, can become a burden. The family sensed movement without understanding its source. Phone calls came more frequently now, even when there was little to report. Investigators checked in, asked gentle questions, reaffirmed commitment. The family listened for tone rather than content. They had learned to read between lines, to recognize restraint as both caution and promise. The waiting changed texture. It became sharper, more alert. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were looped in more consistently, not to authorize action, but to anticipate it. They reviewed what existed and what might plausibly arrive. They discussed scenarios that did not yet exist, but could materialize suddenly. If someone spoke, how would it be documented? If a statement emerged, what corroboration could follow? Planning replaced speculation. Investigators revisited old interviews again, this time not looking for facts, but for cadence. They listened to recordings with headphones on, eyes closed, focusing on rhythm. Where did voices tighten? Where did explanations accelerate? They compared early statements to later ones, aligning phrases like fingerprints. The differences were slight, but they traced an arc. A story that had been polished over years acquires a sheen that can crack under the right light. The park was visited again, though not for evidence. Investigators walked it slowly, not searching, but imagining. They stood where the light thinned, where sound carried poorly. They listened to the city breathe around them. This was not nostalgia. It was calibration. They wanted to feel the environment the way someone familiar with it would have felt, to understand how an encounter could unfold without spectacle. The realization was unsettlingly simple. It would not have taken much. Another tip arrived, shorter than the others, more direct. It did not add facts. It added urgency. The caller spoke as if they were running out of time, though they never said why. The implication was clear enough. Investigators listened, asked careful questions, preserved the statement exactly as given. When the call ended, the room stayed quiet longer than usual. No one rushed to speak. They all understood the shift. The peripheral figure was contacted again, this time with less distance between contacts than before. The reason given was administrative, procedural. The reality was pressure through presence. The interview took place in a familiar room, arranged deliberately the same way it always had been. Familiarity can disarm. It can also unsettle when the stakes change. The conversation began predictably. Background, clarifications, harmless repetition. Then investigators introduced an inconsistency, not as an accusation, but as a question framed around memory. The response was immediate, practiced, and slightly too detailed. The explanation filled space where a simple answer would have sufficed. Investigators noted it and moved on. They were not there to corner. They were there to listen. As the interview progressed, something shifted. Not a confession, not a breakdown. Just fatigue. The kind that appears when a person has been carrying weight too long. Shoulders slumped imperceptibly. Eye contact broke for longer intervals. The voice lost some of its polish. When the interview ended, investigators knew they had not crossed the line, but they had approached it closely enough to be felt. Outside the room, They compared impressions quietly. No one claimed victory. They discussed timing, pressure cycles, the risk of pushing too hard versus waiting too long. Cold cases demand patience, but patience has its own dangers. Momentum can evaporate if not managed carefully. They agreed to slow down without stopping, to let the silence do the work. The city, oblivious, continued to absorb attention elsewhere. New scandals, new tragedies. The disappearance from 2003 flickered briefly in a late-night segment, then reseeded again. That was fine. Investigators no longer needed noise. They needed gravity. A retired detective, one of the originals, reached out unexpectedly. He had been following developments quietly, sensing the change without being told. He offered no new information, only perspective. "You're close," he said. "Not because you found it, because it's starting to find you." He had seen it before. The moment when the past begins to intrude on the present without invitation. The family received a call that was different from the others. Shorter, more measured. Investigators did not raise expectations, but they did not dismiss them either. They acknowledged movement without defining it. The family understood the language. It was the language of professionals who know how easily words can shatter fragile hope. Night returned, as it always did, indifferent to timelines and thresholds. Somewhere, someone replayed the same memories again, perhaps with less certainty than before. The night from 2003 no longer felt distant. It pressed closer, heavier, its edges sharpening instead of dulling. Time, once thought to bury the truth, had instead preserved it, compacted it, made it harder to carry. Cold cases end when silence becomes unsustainable, when the cost of holding outweighs the cost of releasing. Investigators felt the balance shifting, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to prepare for what might come next. The case had not broken yet, but it had begun to bend toward resolution, pulled by forces older than procedure and stronger than fear. The question that lingered now was not whether the truth would surface, but whether it would arrive gently or tear its way out, leaving damage in its wake. The moment did not announce itself. It settled in like pressure before a storm, detectable only to those who had learned to listen for it. Investigators moved carefully now, aware that the case had reached a state where too much force could collapse everything inward, sealing the silence for good. They adjusted not by retreating, but by refining. Every interaction became deliberate, every pause intentional. The peripheral figure began to withdraw in small, telling ways. Calls went unanswered longer. Appointments were postponed. Explanations arrived pre-packaged, polite, plausible. Withdrawal is not guilt, investigators reminded themselves. But it is rarely neutral. People pull back when the space around them feels unsafe, when familiar ground starts to shift. A change in health surfaced quietly, passed along through indirect channels. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediately relevant, but enough to recalibrate timelines. Illness narrows perspective. It compresses the future. Investigators noted it without comment. They had learned that moments like this alter the internal negotiations people conduct with themselves. What once felt manageable can become unbearable. Another interview was scheduled, framed as routine. The room was the same, the arrangement unchanged. Familiarity can be comforting, but it can also emphasize how long something has been going on. The conversation opened with neutral ground, shared history, clarifications that required little effort. The tone was almost casual. Investigators allowed space, letting silence do some of the work. Then a detail was introduced, not as evidence, but as context. A minor inconsistency surfaced gently, presented as something that needed understanding rather than correction. The response came quickly, too quickly. The explanation overlapped itself, circling before landing. Investigators did not interrupt. They watched. When the answer ended, silence followed, heavier than before. That silence lingered. It stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. The peripheral figure filled it reflexively, adding information no one had asked for. It was not incriminating. It was revealing. People talk more when they are unsure how much is already known. Investigators made no move to reassure. They let the moment stand. The interview ended without resolution, but it did not need one. The purpose had shifted. This was no longer about extracting facts. It was about destabilizing certainty, about letting the weight of years press against a narrative that had been carried too long. Outside the room, investigators exchanged looks, brief and restrained. They felt the fracture. Behind closed doors, preparations intensified. Not for arrest, not yet, but for possibility. Recording protocols were reviewed. Documentation standards tightened. They planned for the moment when someone might decide to speak freely, even partially. Partial truths can be dangerous. They require careful handling to avoid distortion. The team aligned on approach, aware that any misstep could poison what followed. The family was kept informed at a distance. Updates were factual, sparse, respectful. Investigators avoided emotional language. They understood how easily optimism can harden into devastation. The family listened with guarded attention, sensing the gravity beneath restraint. They had learned to trust tone more than content. Another tip arrived, this one brief and unambiguous in its urgency. The caller did not linger. They delivered a message and ended the call. It did not introduce new names or locations. It did not need to. It confirmed something investigators already suspected. Someone was watching the investigation closely, measuring its proximity. The silence around the case was no longer passive. It was reactive. Investigators debated timing late into the evening. Push now or wait. Pressure can produce confessions, but it can also produce walls. The decision was not unanimous, but it was decisive. They would maintain presence without escalation. Let the sense of inevitability build. People confess not when they are cornered, but when they believe the corner is unavoidable. The city remained indifferent. Streets filled. Nights passed. The park glowed under improved lighting, children's laughter replacing the hush that once dominated it after dark. Progress layered over memory. For investigators, the contrast was stark. They understood how easily places absorb history without retaining it. A meeting with prosecutors sharpened the stakes. The case, if it moved, would do so without the anchor of a body. The evidentiary bar would be unforgiving. Any statement would need corroboration, context, care. Prosecutors emphasized patience, reminding investigators that a flawed confession could do more harm than silence. The team agreed. They had come too far to rush. The peripheral figure began to exhibit signs of strain that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Sleep disruption, miscommitments, emotional volatility reported by others. These were not crimes. They were indicators. Investigators noted them, not as leverage, but as signals of internal conflict. Secrets surface when the effort to contain them outweighs the fear of exposure. A routine check-in was scheduled again, then canceled, then rescheduled. The explanation was vague. Investigators allowed it. Delay can be a form of negotiation. People test boundaries before crossing them. The next meeting was set for a date closer than usual, closing the gaps that once provided comfort. When the interview resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The peripheral figure appeared tired, not physically, but in a deeper sense. Answers came slower. The familiar cadence faltered. When asked about the night of the disappearance, the response included a phrase investigators had not heard before. It was minor, almost nothing, but it was new. Newness matters. It suggests recalibration. Stories told for years rarely change unless something forces them to. Investigators asked to follow up, gently, inviting elaboration. The answer hesitated, then corrected itself. A pause followed, longer this time, charged with possibility. The silence pressed in from all sides. Nothing was said. Not yet. The interview ended again without conclusion. But the shift was undeniable. The narrative was no longer sealed. It had begun to leak. Afterward, investigators documented everything meticulously. Words, pauses, tone, the shape of hesitation. They compared notes, aligning impressions. No one spoke of confession. They spoke of readiness. They sensed that the moment, when it came, would not arrive loudly. It would arrive quietly, almost apologetically. The family waited, carrying a tension that had become familiar and foreign at once. They oscillated between bracing and hoping, unsure which was safer. The absence that had defined their lives for years now felt restless, as if disturbed by movement beneath its surface. Cold cases reach a point where the past stops receding and starts advancing. The night from 2003 was no longer distant. It had moved forward, pressing into the present with increasing insistence. Investigators felt it in their conversations, in their planning, in the way the case no longer felt static. Somewhere, a decision was approaching, whether to speak fully, partially, or not at all, whether to carry the weight to the end or set it down and face what followed. Investigators could not make that decision for anyone. They could only be present when it happened. The case had not resolved. Not yet, but the silence that had protected it for so long was thinning. And when silence thins, it does not disappear evenly. It tears. The tear did not widen all at once. It spread slowly, like fabric stressed beyond its limit, fibers separating without sound. Investigators recognized the stage immediately. This was the phase where certainty unravels not because of evidence, but because the human body can no longer sustain the lie it has been trained to protect. The case was no longer static. It was breathing unevenly, as if waking from a long sleep. The peripheral figure began to lose control of timing. Messages arrived at odd hours. Questions were asked that had already been answered years earlier. Clarifications were requested about procedures no one else worried about. These were not admissions. They were symptoms. Anxiety leaves fingerprints long before guilt ever does. Investigators maintained a careful distance. They did not rush to fill gaps. They did not escalate language. They understood that proximity, not confrontation, was the sharper tool now. Presence creates gravity. Gravity pulls things down whether they want to fall or not. Another interview was requested, this time initiated from the other side. The request itself was framed casually, almost offhand, but investigators heard the strain beneath it. People rarely ask to revisit old conversations unless something has shifted internally. The meeting was scheduled quickly, without urgency, but without delay. Time mattered now, but so did tone. The room felt different when they sat down. Familiar, yes, but familiarity had lost its comfort. The peripheral figure spoke first, filling space with small talk that drifted nowhere. Investigators let happen. This was not avoidance, it was stalling. When the conversation turned to the past, the shift was immediate. The voice tightened. Sentences shortened. The story emerged again, mostly unchanged, but thinner somehow, as if worn by repetition. Then came the first fracture, a correction that did not need to be made, a clarification offered before confusion existed. Investigators did not challenge it. They marked it silently. Stories maintained over decades develop pressure points. This was one of them. Silence followed. It lingered long enough to expose discomfort. The peripheral figure broke it with a sigh that was almost imperceptible, but real. Shoulders dipped. The mask slipped, not fully, but enough to glimpse what lay beneath. Investigators asked a question that was not accusatory, not leading. It was simple, open, an invitation rather than a trap. The answer began confidently, then faltered. Words rearranged themselves mid-sentence. The explanation doubled back, contradicting itself in small ways that might have gone unnoticed in another context. Investigators let it run its course. Interrupting would have offered relief. They were not there to offer relief. When the answer ended, there was another silence. This one felt different, heavier. It carried the weight of something unsaid pressing against the surface. The peripheral figure looked down, then up, then away. The moment passed without a confession, but it left residue. Everyone in the room felt it. The interview ended shortly after, deliberately. Investigators knew better than to push through fatigue. Fatigue creates mistakes, but it also breeds resentment. They wanted the door open, not slammed shut. As the peripheral figure left, there was no visible relief. If anything, the strain appeared sharper. Behind closed doors, the team regrouped. No one used the word confession. They talked instead about readiness, about proximity. They reviewed notes, aligned impressions. The cracks were undeniable now. The narrative had begun to fracture under its own weight. Prosecutors were updated with care. They listened without interruption, aware that they were being briefed on possibility, not fact. They asked the right questions. What changed? What was new? What could be corroborated if someone spoke more freely? The discussion was pragmatic, grounded. No one wanted a rushed ending. A bad ending can be worse than none at all. The family was informed that conversations were ongoing. Nothing more, nothing less. The restraint was intentional. They had lived with hope long enough to know its volatility. Even so, the shift was palpable. Calls were answered faster now. Waiting felt different. The air around the absence had changed. Outside the investigation, life pressed on. The city cycled through headlines, tragedies, celebrations. The disappearance from 2003 existed, now mostly as an echo, remembered only by those who had been marked by it. That obscurity was both a blessing and a danger. Fewer eyes meant fewer distractions. Fewer distractions meant fewer places to hide. The peripheral figure began to show signs of internal negotiation, not outwardly dramatic, but visible to those trained to look. Increased contact followed by withdrawal. Questions about consequences asked obliquely, through hypothetical language. References to time, to age, to things left undone. Investigators noted it all. This was the sound of someone weighing silence against exposure. Another life event intersected unexpectedly. Not catastrophic, but significant enough to alter perspective. Investigators observed without comment. These moments often accelerate decisions. When the future contracts, the past expands. Secrets feel heavier when there is less road ahead. A late-night call came in, not to investigators directly, but through an intermediary. The message was cautious, incomplete. "They're not sleeping," the caller said. "They keep talking about the past." It was not evidence. It was insight. Investigators documented it carefully, aware of its fragility. They debated next steps. Push now or wait. The calculus had shifted again. Waiting carried the risk of retreat, of walls rebuilding themselves. Pushing carried the risk of collapse. They chose a middle path. One more conversation, framed not as interrogation, but as opportunity. Opportunity to clarify. Opportunity to speak without interruption. The meeting was set for the following week. The days leading up to it stretched unnaturally, thick with anticipation. Investigators prepared meticulously. Questions were pared down to essentials. No theatrics. No pressure tactics. The goal was not to break someone, but to let them break their own silence. The room was arranged differently this time. Subtly. Chairs repositioned. The table cleared of unnecessary clutter. The environment was designed to feel less procedural, more human. Confessions emerge more readily when the setting does not scream authority. When the peripheral figure arrived, they looked older than they had weeks before. Not physically, but in posture and expression. The energy that had once fueled defensiveness was gone, replaced by something closer to resignation. Investigators noticed immediately. They adjusted accordingly. The conversation began slowly, not with the night itself, but with the years that followed. How life had unfolded. What it was like to carry memory. The questions were open-ended, almost reflective. The peripheral figure answered cautiously, then more freely. Words came easier when not tethered to specifics. Then the conversation edged closer, not abruptly, gradually. Investigators referenced the past in general terms, inviting commentary rather than confrontation. The peripheral figure responded with hesitation, then honesty in small doses. Statements that acknowledged weight without naming its source. A moment arrived where silence settled again, heavier than before. This time, it did not break immediately. The peripheral figure stared at the table, hands clenched lightly, as if bracing. Investigators waited. They understood that this silence was doing work no question could. When speech returned, it was quieter, less structured. The tone had shifted from defense to disclosure, though the line had not yet been crossed. Words hovered near the truth without touching it. Investigators did not interrupt. They did not steer. They allowed the narrative to approach its own edge. The session ended without a full admission, but with something just as significant, a visible collapse of certainty. The story that had been carried for decades no longer held its shape. It sagged under the weight of its own maintenance. Afterward, the room stayed quiet. Investigators sat with the moment, aware that they were closer than they had ever been. Not to resolution, but to surrender. Cold cases rarely resolve because of evidence alone. They resolve because someone decides they can no longer live with the silence. The city slept, unaware that a long-buried night was beginning to surface. The absence that had haunted families and files alike was stirring, restless. The truth had not emerged yet, but it had begun to press upward, pushing against years of denial and fear. The case had entered its final tension, the kind that precedes either collapse or release. And everyone involved understood that whatever came next would change everything, whether it ended in answers or in a silence so heavy it would finally have to be named. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no flashing lights slicing through dawn. Just a gray sky settling over the city, indifferent as ever. Inside the task force office, however, the atmosphere was charged, tight with focus. This was the hour where instincts mattered more than preparation, where years of restraint narrowed into a single line of action. The call came shortly after 8. Not dramatic, not panicked. A controlled voice requesting to speak, asking if the conversation from the previous week could continue. There was no explanation attached, no emotional flourish. Just a name, a pause, and a willingness that had not existed before. Investigators exchanged looks. No one smiled. This was not victory. This was gravity doing its work. They agreed to meet the same day. Delay would only allow doubt to return. The location was chosen carefully, familiar but neutral, a space that no longer carried the weight of interrogation but still held accountability. When the peripheral figure arrived, there was no pretense left. The posture was collapsed inward, shoulders rounded, eyes unfocused, as if already somewhere else. The years had finally caught up. The conversation resumed without formalities. No reminders of rights, no rehearsed framing. Everyone in the room understood the threshold they were standing on. Investigators spoke softly, grounding the exchange in continuity rather than confrontation. The peripheral figure listened, nodded, breathed unevenly. The mask had not just slipped. It had been set aside. There was a moment, brief, fragile, where retreat seemed possible. A deep breath, a glance toward the door. Investigators did nothing. Silence was their ally now. Silence leaves space for conscience to surface. When speech returned, it did not follow a script. It came out fractured, non-linear, punctuated by pauses that stretched and snapped. Details emerged not as a narrative, but as fragments of memory long suppressed. A location described not by name, but by smell. A night recalled through weather, not time. The past reassembled itself imperfectly, but unmistakably. Investigators listened without interruption. They did not correct inconsistencies. They did not seek chronology. They understood that truth, when buried for decades, surfaces in pieces. The peripheral figure spoke of fear, of panic, of decisions made too quickly and lived with forever. The words were not polished. They were raw, clumsy, heavy with regret. Then came the pivot, a sentence that crossed an invisible line. Not a confession yet, but an acknowledgement of presence, of proximity, of being there when no one else was supposed to be. The room seemed to contract around that admission. Investigators exchanged no looks. They let the weight settle where it belonged. As the account continued, a pattern formed. Actions described without justification. Consequences acknowledged without excuse. The story no longer defended itself. It exposed itself. Investigators asked a single clarifying question, neutral and precise. The answer came slower this time, but it came. Names were avoided. Pronouns did the work instead. But intent was clear. Harm had occurred. Control had been lost. Panic had dictated the aftermath. The peripheral figure's voice wavered, then steadied, as if the act of speaking had shifted something fundamental. Secrets lose power once they are named, even partially. When the final piece surfaced, it did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, slipped into the space between breaths. An admission not just of involvement, but of responsibility. The sentence landed and stayed there, irreversible. Investigators did not respond immediately. They allowed the moment to exist without commentary. This was not theater. This was consequence. When they did speak, it was to clarify, to confirm understanding, to anchor the statement in reality. The peripheral figure nodded. There was no resistance left to muster. The next steps unfolded methodically. A written statement requested, reviewed, refined. Legal counsel contacted. Procedures followed with care. The transition from conversation to custody was seamless, almost understated. There was no outburst, no protest, just a quiet acceptance that the long avoidance had ended. As the figure was escorted from the room, investigators felt no surge of triumph, only a profound stillness, the kind that follows a storm that took years to form, the kind that leaves behind altered terrain. Word moved quickly but discreetly. Prosecutors were briefed in person. Evidence was revisited with new context, old fragments snapping into alignment. What had once been circumstantial now carried weight. What had been dismissed now demanded attention. The case file, dormant for so long, pulsed with relevance. The family was notified in the afternoon. The call was handled with restraint, compassion guiding every word. No promises were made beyond truth. Silence followed on the other end of the line, then a sound that was neither relief nor grief, but something in between. A release of breath held for 20 years. By evening, the city began to hum with the first hints of revelation. Not headlines yet, just murmurs. A presence outside a precinct that hadn't seen a camera in years. A reporter making calls that went unanswered. The machinery of public attention was waking up, drawn by the scent of resolution. Inside holding, the peripheral figure sat alone. The weight of what had been said pressed down, heavy but no longer crushing. Confession does not erase guilt. It rearranges it. The silence that had once protected now suffocated. Speaking had been the only way out. Investigators returned to their desks, not to celebrate, but to document. Every word, every timestamp, every procedural step recorded with care. They knew the road ahead was still long. Confession opens doors, but it does not close cases. Courts would decide the rest. Night fell again, but this time it felt different. The absence that had haunted the city for decades had finally been given shape. Not closure, not justice yet, but form. The unknown had narrowed into something human, accountable, finite. Somewhere, a name was about to re-enter public consciousness, no longer as a question mark, but as an answer. The cold case, frozen in time since 2003, had shifted at last. The ice had cracked, not with a shatter, but with a slow, deliberate break. And as lights dimmed across the city, one truth settled in with unmistakable clarity. The silence that once protected the guilty had finally given way, and nothing, no years passed, no memories blurred, would ever put it back together again.